Some places aren't abandoned because people forgot them. They're abandoned because someone wanted them forgotten. Off the edge of a storm-beaten coastline stands a lighthouse that hasn't officially worked in more than 50 years. Its power was cut. Its machinery rusted away. Every government record insists its light can never shine again. So why, on one violent night, did a veteran fishing captain watch that dead lighthouse burst to life? He followed its beam. By sunrise, both the captain and his boat had vanished. No distress call. No body. Only broken wreckage drifting across a silent sea. Days later, an investigative journalist received an anonymous package containing a faded photograph of that same lighthouse and a handwritten warning. It was never meant to shine again. What he uncovered would expose one of the darkest secrets ever buried beneath a lighthouse, and reveal that the real horror was never the light itself. Ethan read the sentence twice before looking back at the photograph, unaware that one impossible light had already changed the course of his life forever. The island that erased its own history. 3 days later, Ethan stepped off a weathered ferry onto the windswept island where Captain Hayes had last been seen. The salty air carried the scent of seaweed and old timber, while thick gray clouds hung low enough to swallow the lighthouse hidden somewhere beyond the cliffs. He expected curious locals eager to discuss the disappearance. Instead, every conversation ended the moment he mentioned the tower. People lowered their eyes. Shopkeepers suddenly found work behind dusty shelves. Children were quietly called indoors. It was as though the lighthouse itself had become a forbidden word. Ethan visited the small town archive, hoping facts would prove more reliable than frightened whispers. Dust covered every shelf, yet something felt strangely organized. Newspaper editions covering the lighthouse's final years were missing. Census books skipped entire families without explanation. Even the oldest maps disagreed about where the lighthouse road had once been. Nothing disappeared by accident so completely. The town clerk forced a polite smile and insisted storms had destroyed many historical records. His trembling hands betrayed him. When Ethan asked for maintenance reports from the old lighthouse, the man quietly locked the cabinet and walked away without another word. As evening settled across the island, Ethan wandered towards the harbor, where an elderly woman sat repairing worn fishing nets. Unlike everyone else, she watched him approach instead of turning away. "You came because of the light," she said softly. Ethan nodded. For several long moments, she continued tying careful knots before speaking again. "People think the lighthouse kept ships safe." She looked towards the distant cliffs, her expression filled with memories she wished she could forget. "It never kept secrets," she whispered. "It buried them." Before Ethan could ask another question, she gathered her nets and disappeared into the growing mist, leaving him alone with the crashing waves, unanswered questions, and the unsettling feeling that someone else had been quietly watching their entire conversation. The Last Keeper's Journal. The following morning, Ethan climbed the narrow trail leading to the abandoned keeper's cottage. Wind rattled loose shutters against weathered walls, and wild ivy had swallowed much of the small stone house. The front door creaked open with little effort, as though no one had bothered to lock it in decades. Inside, time had almost stopped. A cracked teacup rested beside a cold fireplace. Dust blanketed every surface, yet one chair remained strangely clean, as if someone had been sitting there not long ago. Ethan brushed the thought aside and began searching the rooms. Hours passed without answers. Just as he prepared to leave, a loose floorboard shifted beneath his boot. Kneeling carefully, he pried it open and uncovered a leather-bound journal wrapped in faded oilcloth. The cover carried only 3 worn words. Keeper's Daily Log. The first entries were ordinary enough. Notes about cleaning the lantern, repairing broken windows, checking weather conditions, and recording passing ships filled the pages. The keeper's handwriting was neat, confident, almost comforting. Then everything changed. The entries grew shorter. "I heard knocking beneath the tower again. They told me it was the sea. It isn't. Thomas says he heard voices last night. He's leaving tomorrow. A few pages later, Thomas's name never appeared again. Instead, new sentences crowded the margins, written in hurried, uneven strokes. They're hiding something below. The light wasn't turned on for ships. If anyone finds this. The sentence ended there. Ethan quickly turned the page. Nothing. Several pages had been ripped out with deliberate care. His pulse quickened. Whatever the keeper had written during those missing days had been important enough for someone to erase forever. As Ethan closed the journal, a loud thud echoed from outside the cottage. He rushed to the doorway. The path was empty. Only the wind moved through the tall grass. Yet lying on the porch where nothing had been moments earlier was a single, rusted lighthouse key. Someone knew he had found the journal. And someone wanted him to keep searching. Section 4, Voices Beneath the Stone. The rusted key felt cold in Ethan's palm as he climbed the final stretch toward the lighthouse. Every step echoed with the distant cry of gulls and the relentless pounding of waves below. Up close, the tower looked even older than it had in the photograph. Cracks split the weathered stone, iron railings hung twisted with rust, and salt-covered windows reflected nothing but the gray sky. The key turned with surprising ease. The heavy door groaned open, releasing a breath of stale, damp air that smelled of seawater and forgotten years. Inside, silence ruled. A spiral staircase disappeared into darkness above, while the lantern room remained hidden far beyond the shadows. Ethan's flashlight swept across broken furniture, shattered glass, and machinery that had long ago surrendered to rust. Every official report had claimed the lighthouse was stripped of its equipment decades earlier, yet pieces of polished brass looked strangely untouched, as though someone had cared for them in secret. Then he heard it. Knock. 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 The sound came from somewhere beneath his feet. Ethan held his breath. It wasn't the random creak of old timber or the crash of waves against the cliffs. The rhythm was deliberate, steady, almost patient. He searched the ground floor until he noticed faint lines carved into the stone floor. Brushing away years of dust revealed the outline of a sealed trapdoor, hidden so carefully it almost vanished into the rock itself. His pulse raced. Back at the town archive, he compared faded engineering drawings with modern blueprints. The originals showed a lower level beneath the lighthouse. Every newer version had erased it completely. Someone had rewritten the building's history. That night, exhausted, Ethan returned to the small guest house carrying copies of the forgotten plans. He woke to the sound of a closing window. The room was empty. His wallet, camera, and laptop remained untouched. Only the lighthouse maps were gone. Standing at the open window, Ethan looked toward the distant cliffs. For the first time, he was certain of one thing. He wasn't investigating the lighthouse anymore. Someone inside its secret had begun investigating him. The Watchers. The stolen maps changed everything. Until now, Ethan had believed he was chasing the ghost of an old mystery. Now the mystery has reached back. Someone had entered his room without taking anything of value, risking exposure for a handful of forgotten drawings. That meant the hidden chamber beneath the lighthouse still mattered to someone. The next morning, he hiked along the rugged cliffs, hoping the fresh sea air would clear his thoughts. Instead, it sharpened them. A figure stood motionless on a distant ridge. Wrapped in a dark raincoat, the stranger faced the lighthouse rather than the sea. Ethan raised a hand, but the figure disappeared behind the rocks. He hurried across the uneven ground, only to find empty cliffs and footprints already fading beneath the wind. He wasn't alone on the island. Later that afternoon, a retired Coast Guard officer named Daniel Mercer agreed to meet him in an abandoned boathouse at the edge of the harbor. The old man's weathered face carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent years keeping silent. "We weren't protecting ships," Mercer said quietly. "We were keeping them away." Ethan frowned. Every captain received the same order. If the weather pushed them anywhere near this island, we redirected them. No exceptions. Who gave those orders? Mercer's eyes drifted towards the lighthouse visible beyond the cliffs. They came from people far above my rank. Before Ethan could ask another question, a loud engine roared outside. A black vehicle sped away from the boathouse, spraying gravel across the road. Mercer rushed to the doorway. "I never told you my name," he whispered, his voice suddenly unsteady. "So how did they know I was here?" The following morning, the island awoke to terrible news. Daniel Mercer had been found dead at the bottom of the harbor cliffs. The official report called it a tragic fall. Almost no one questioned it. But as Ethan stared at the waves below, he noticed the same dark-coated figure standing silently on the opposite cliff, watching him without moving. And this time, the watcher didn't disappear. Daniel Mercer's death settled over the island like another layer of fog. No flowers appeared at the harbor. No one spoke his name. By sunset, it was as if the retired officer had never existed. The silence disturbed Ethan more than the funeral ever could have. He returned to the lighthouse after midnight. The wind had eased, leaving only the steady rhythm of waves striking the cliffs below. With the rusted key in one hand and the journal in the other, he crossed the deserted ground floor until his flashlight settled on the faint outline of the hidden trapdoor. The knocking had stopped. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined it all. Then he noticed tiny scratches around the edge of the stone cover, fresh enough to catch the light. Someone had opened it recently. Bracing himself, Ethan forced the trapdoor upward. A rush of cold, stale air escaped from the darkness below. Narrow stone steps spiraled into the earth, disappearing beyond the reach of his flashlight. Every instinct urged him to turn back. Instead, he descended. The air grew colder with every step. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, each drop echoing through the passage like a distant heartbeat. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber far larger than the lighthouse itself. Ethan stood frozen. Rows of rusted machines filled the room, connected by thick cables that vanished into cracked walls. Heavy iron doors lined one side of the chamber, each secured with enormous chains. Dust covered everything except a narrow path leading deeper inside. This place had not been abandoned naturally. It had been sealed. On the far wall, strange symbols had been carved into the stone beside faded technical diagrams and handwritten notes. None resembled religious markings. They looked more like coded instructions left behind by desperate hands. As Ethan stepped closer, his flashlight revealed something that stole the breath from his lungs. A fresh footprint crossed the dusty floor. It wasn't his. Someone else had entered the chamber, and they hadn't left. Section 7, The Forgotten Experiment. Ethan switched off his flashlight. Darkness swallowed the chamber, leaving only the faint sound of dripping water somewhere ahead. He listened carefully, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Whoever had left the footprint was close enough to have entered recently, yet the underground hall remained eerily still. After several tense moments, he clicked the light back on. The footprint continued through the dust before vanishing at a heavy steel door hanging slightly ajar. Ethan pushed it open, its rusted hinges groaning like a wounded animal. Beyond it lay a smaller room lined with metal filing cabinets, broken desks, and shelves stacked with water-damaged documents. Most had rotted beyond recognition. One locked cabinet had not. Inside were neatly bundled folders stamped with faded government seals and the words Project Beacon. Ethan's pulse quickened. The first reports described an experimental naval communication system developed during the final years of the war. Scientists believed the lighthouse could broadcast powerful long-range signals across the sea, allowing fleets to communicate without interception. It sounded ordinary. Too ordinary. The deeper he read, the stranger the records became. Technicians complained of sleepless nights after working below the tower. Radio operators reported hearing voices hidden beneath ordinary transmissions. Several crew members requested immediate transfers, claiming the underground equipment affected their minds. Official investigators dismissed every complaint as exhaustion. Yet tucked inside the final folder, Ethan found handwritten witness statements that had never been filed. We weren't hearing voices through the machines. They came from behind the walls. The broadcast stopped 3 nights ago. The whispers didn't. Ethan slowly lowered the papers. The official story explained the machinery. It explained the secrecy. But it explained nothing else. As he slipped the files into his bag, a loud metallic clang echoed through the chamber. Someone had slammed the steel door shut. Then footsteps began moving slowly towards him through the darkness. Section 8, the names no one spoke. The footsteps stopped just beyond the steel door. Ethan held his breath, gripping the cold edge of a rusted cabinet. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the footsteps retreated into the darkness. Whoever had been there hadn't tried to confront him. They wanted him to know he wasn't alone. He waited until silence returned before forcing the heavy door open. The chamber outside was empty. His flashlight swept across the floor, catching only drifting dust and a fading outline of fresh footprints leading deeper into another tunnel. He resisted the urge to follow. Instead, he searched the remaining cabinets. Hidden beneath a false drawer, he uncovered a small wooden box wrapped in faded canvas. Inside rested dozens of neatly folded letters, each tied with brittle string. None had ever been mailed. Every letter carried a different name. Every name belonged to someone officially listed as missing at sea. Beneath the letters lay a bronze memorial plaque no larger than a notebook. It had never been mounted anywhere. Across its worn surface were 37 carefully engraved names. Not one appeared in the island's public records. Ethan stared in disbelief. These people had not vanished in storms. They had been erased. The letters told the same heartbreaking story from different voices. Mothers waiting for sons who never returned. Wives refusing to believe their husbands had abandoned them. Children writing birthday messages to fathers they hoped would walk through the door one more time. None of them ever received an answer. Tucked beneath the final envelope was a recent photograph. Unlike everything else in the box, it was only months old. It showed the elderly woman from the harbor standing beside a much younger man outside the lighthouse. Written across the back were 6 simple words. She remembers because I cannot return. Ethan's mind raced. The anonymous package. The forgotten photograph. The warning. At last, he understood. Someone who knew the truth was still alive. And somewhere on the island, they were waiting for him to find them before someone else did first. Section 9, the night the sea went silent. The photograph never left Ethan's hand. By dawn, he had pinned every document, letter, and witness statement across the wall of his small room. Alone, each piece revealed almost nothing. Together, they formed the outline of a single night the island had spent decades trying to erase. It began with a storm. Not unlike the one that had swallowed Captain Hayes. An old weather log recorded towering waves and hurricane-force winds, while Coast Guard reports insisted all ships had safely changed course. But personal diaries told another story. Fishing crews spoke of seeing the lighthouse beam cut through the rain after years of darkness. Survivors described an unnatural silence falling over the sea, as though the wind itself had vanished. Then came the light. Instead of sweeping steadily across open water, the beam shifted again and again, pointing directly toward the jagged reefs hidden beneath the surface. Several captains trusted it without hesitation. After all, that was what a lighthouse was meant to do. Minutes later, the first ship struck the rocks. Others followed. Witnesses recalled hearing steel tearing apart and desperate cries carried across the water. Yet one detail appeared in every private account, no matter who had written it. The cries did not come only from the sinking vessels. Some echoed from beneath the lighthouse. Official investigators blamed faulty navigation, violent weather, and poor visibility. The files were signed, archived, and quietly forgotten. But none of them explained why experienced sailors had followed a beam leading straight into disaster. Nor did they explain why every survivor insisted the light had changed direction on its own. As Ethan closed the final journal, another possibility emerged. Perhaps the lighthouse had never failed that night. Perhaps someone had been controlling it. Outside, the evening fog rolled over the cliffs once more. Far above the crashing waves, the dark tower stood motionless against the fading sky. Then, for the briefest instant, a faint white glow flickered behind the lantern room glass. Someone was inside. The keeper's choice. Ethan didn't wait for sunrise. With the journals, letters, and Project Beacon files packed tightly into his satchel, he climbed toward the lighthouse beneath a moon hidden by thick clouds. The faint glow had vanished, leaving the tower dark once more, but he knew what he had seen. Someone had entered the building after all these years. The lantern room was empty. Its shattered windows overlooked a restless sea, and the ancient lens stood motionless beneath a blanket of dust. Yet something caught Ethan's eye. One brass bolt securing the mechanism looked newer than the others. He loosened it carefully. A small metal compartment sprang open. Inside rested a sealed envelope, protected from time by layers of waxed cloth. Across the front, written in steady handwriting, were 4 words. For whoever finds this. The letter was signed by Jonathan Reed, the lighthouse's final keeper. I know history will call me a coward, it began. They will say I abandoned my post. Let them. Better that than allowing anyone to discover what they planned below. Reed described nights filled with arguments between military officials and frightened engineers. Whatever had begun as Project Beacon had become something far beyond its original purpose. He never explained exactly what changed, only that innocent people started arriving under armed guard. They told me silence would protect the nation, he wrote. Instead, it protected the guilty. The final pages revealed his impossible decision. Rather than obey orders, Reed had deliberately crippled the lighthouse, destroying vital equipment before sealing the underground passage. He knew ships might lose a beacon, but he believed reopening the chamber would unleash a far greater tragedy. His last sentence stopped Ethan cold. I removed the final pages from my journal because the truth is too dangerous in the wrong hands. Ethan slowly folded the letter. The missing pages still existed. Somewhere on the island, they had survived. And whoever had been watching him since the day he arrived was almost certainly searching for them too. Section 11, The Secret Beneath the Light. The search ended where the story had begun. The elderly woman from the harbor opened her door before Ethan could knock, as though she had been expecting him all along. Without a word, she led him into a small back room where an old wooden chest rested beneath a faded blanket. Inside lay the missing journal pages. Her hands trembled as she placed them before him. My father was Jonathan Reed, she whispered. Before he disappeared, he made me promise these pages would only be read by someone willing to tell the truth, no matter the cost. Ethan unfolded the brittle paper. The first lines shattered everything he believed. Project Beacon had never become haunted. It had become convenient. The underground chamber wasn't built to imprison monsters or contain supernatural forces. It had been transformed into a secret detention facility where civilians, suspected spies, and political prisoners were questioned beyond the reach of courts, families, or history. Those who survived were forced into silence. Those who didn't were quietly erased from every official record. The mysterious voices reported by workers had never belonged to ghosts. They belonged to prisoners. The knocking beneath the lighthouse had been desperate people begging to be heard. Jonathan Reed had discovered the truth too late. Horrified, he destroyed the lighthouse's operating system, sealed the underground passages, hid the evidence, and vanished before those responsible could stop him. To protect the secret, officials invented stories of cursed lights, haunted cliffs, and dangerous waters. Fear became the perfect guard, while silence became the strongest lock. Suddenly every missing record, every frightened witness, every stolen map, and every warning fell into place. There had never been a monster beneath the lighthouse. Only ordinary people committing extraordinary cruelty. Ethan looked up from the final page, unable to speak. Outside, dawn's first light touched the old tower for the first time in years. The greatest secret hidden beneath the lighthouse was not what had been buried there. It was how many people had chosen to bury the truth with it. Section 12 and final section. When the light finally went out. For a long time, Ethan simply stared at the journal pages. The weight of the truth settled over him like the morning mist rolling across the cliffs. He knew that publishing the story would not bring back the lost lives or erase decades of suffering. It would, however, give names back to people who had been denied even the dignity of being remembered. Within weeks, his investigation reached the world. Government archives were reopened. Independent investigators descended upon the island. The underground chamber was excavated, and the forgotten evidence was finally brought into the light. Families who had spent generations believing their loved ones had vanished at sea learned the heartbreaking truth. Their grief remained, but uncertainty no longer haunted them. Not everyone welcomed the revelations. Some argued that the past should remain buried. Others feared the consequences of exposing a crime hidden for so many years. Yet the voices calling for silence grew quieter with every document uncovered and every forgotten name restored. The abandoned lighthouse changed forever. The rusted chains were removed. The underground prison was preserved as a memorial instead of being sealed again. Along the entrance, 37 names were engraved into polished stone, ensuring that no visitor could pass without seeing the people history had once tried to erase. On the morning of the memorial's opening, Ethan stood alone on the cliffs as workers climbed the tower one final time. The old lantern, restored only for the investigation, shone across the sea for a few brief moments before its power was switched off forever. Darkness returned. This time, it was peaceful. The lighthouse no longer needed to warn ships. Its purpose had become something greater. It stood as proof that even the deepest secrets cannot survive forever when someone refuses to stop asking questions. As the sun rose above the endless ocean, Ethan turned away from the tower and began the walk back toward the island. Behind him, the forgotten lighthouse remained silent at last. Some lights guide sailors home. The most important ones guide the truth home.